Before we reach the battlefields, let us first pause and remember what the world was like in 1914, when the war began. Europe was a place of cobblestone streets and country lanes. Cities were growing, yes, factories were rising, but beyond the urban centers, life still moved at the pace it had for centuries. Farmers plowed their fields with horses. Merchants delivered goods by cart. Even the grandest armies of the most powerful empires relied on horses to pull their cannons, carry their supplies, and transport their wounded. The horse was not just a tool. It was a partner. A presence woven into the fabric of daily life. Every town had its blacksmith, whose forge rang out in the early morning as he shaped shoes for the horses that would work that day. Every village had its stables, smelling of hay and leather and warm animal breath. Children grew up learning to harness a team, to read the mood of a horse by the flick of its ear, to calm a nervous mare with a steady hand and a soft voice. In Germany, this relationship was especially deep. The German military had spent decades preparing for war, and horses were central to their plans. They had breeding programs to ensure strong, resilient animals. They had veterinary schools. They had detailed manuals on how to care for horses in the field, how to ration their feed, treat their injuries, and keep them calm under the thunder of artillery. When the war began in the summer of 1914, Germany mobilized nearly 2.8 million horses. Imagine that number for a moment. Not machines, but living creatures, each one with its own temperament, its own needs. Each one requiring food, water, rest, and care. Each one vulnerable to exhaustion, disease, and fear. These horses pulled supply wagons along muddy roads. They hauled heavy artillery into position. They carried cavalry officers across open fields, their hoofs pounding in rhythm like a drum. They were everywhere, a vast, breathing, moving network of muscle and sinew, holding the German war effort together. But horses are not tireless. A horse can pull a wagon for hours, yes, but then it must rest. It must eat pounds and pounds of hay and grain each day. It must drink. It must be groomed, shod, tended to by farriers and grooms. And if it falls ill, or is injured, or simply collapses from exhaustion, it must be replaced. By 1917, after 3 years of grinding, brutal war, the strain was beginning to show. Horses were dying by the thousands, not just from enemy fire, but from overwork, from hunger, from disease. The roads of Europe were littered with their bodies. And Germany, despite all its planning, was struggling to replace them. And so the war dragged on, and the armies moved slowly, at the pace of hooves on dirt, while across the Atlantic, in a young and industrializing nation, a different kind of power was stirring. The United States had been watching. And when it finally entered the war in 1917, it brought with it something Germany had not fully anticipated. Not more horses, but trucks. And in the quiet hum of those engines, the future was beginning to arrive. Outside, the evening air is still, and somewhere far away, a horse whinnies softly in its stable, unaware that the world is changing. When the United States declared war on Germany in April of 1917, it faced an enormous challenge. America had a small army, fewer than 200,000 soldiers. It had vast resources, yes, factories, farmland, a growing population, but turning those resources into a fighting force capable of tipping the balance in Europe? That would take time, and planning, and a willingness to try something new. The American military leaders looked at the war in Europe and saw the problem clearly. This was not a war of swift cavalry charges or rapid maneuvers. This was a war of attrition. A war of supply lines stretching for hundreds of miles. A war where victory would go not to the side with the most courage, but to the side that could keep its soldiers fed, armed, and equipped. And the traditional method, using horses, was breaking down. So the Americans made a choice. A gamble, really. They decided to bet on the internal combustion engine. Now, trucks were not new in 1917. They had been around for about 2 decades. But they were still relatively rare, especially in military use. Most armies had a few trucks for special purposes, but horses remained the backbone of logistics. Trucks were loud, mechanical, temperamental. They broke down. They needed fuel, which had to be transported and stored. They needed mechanics who understood their mysterious workings. But trucks had advantages too. A truck could carry far more than a horse-drawn wagon. It could travel faster. It didn't need to rest as often. It didn't need to eat. And most importantly, if a truck broke down, you could fix it. If a horse died, it was gone. The American Expeditionary Forces, under General John J. Pershing, embraced this new technology with an enthusiasm that surprised even their allies. They arrived in France not with great herds of horses, but with convoys of trucks, Model T Fords converted for military use, larger Liberty trucks, tractors for hauling artillery. At first, the French and British were skeptical. Trucks seemed unreliable, fragile. The roads of war-torn France were muddy, rutted, shell-cratered nightmares. Surely, they thought, these machines would get stuck, break down, become useless. But the Americans were patient. They built repair depots. They trained mechanics. They experimented with different tire designs, different gear ratios. They learned how to keep the trucks moving. And slowly, something remarkable began to happen. The American supply lines moved faster, more reliably. A convoy of trucks could deliver in one night what would take a team of horses several days. The Americans could reposition their forces quickly, respond to changing conditions, keep their soldiers supplied even in the most difficult terrain. The Germans, watching from the other side, began to realize what they were facing. This was not just a difference in technology. It was a difference in philosophy. A difference in how war itself was being waged. The old world, the world of horses and tradition and centuries-old ways of doing things, was meeting the new world. The world of engines and innovation and industrial might. And the old world slowly, painfully, was beginning to lose. But let us not move too quickly. There is still much to understand. The transition was not instant. The horse did not vanish overnight. For every truck that arrived, there were still thousands of horses, still laboring, still suffering, still essential to the war effort. The story is more complicated than simply new defeats old. And that is what we will explore next. The night deepens, and somewhere in the distance, a truck engine idles softly, while nearby, a horse sleeps standing, its weight shifting gently from hoof to hoof. Let us pause now, and step away from the grand strategies and the sweeping changes, and focus instead on something smaller. Something intimate. A single horse. A German cavalry horse, perhaps. Let us call him Max. Max is not a war horse in the dramatic sense. He does not carry a knight in shining armor. He is a working horse, a draft horse, bred for strength and endurance. His coat is a dark brown, flecked with mud. His mane is short and practical. His eyes are large and dark and patient. Max's day begins before dawn. His handler, a young man named Franz, arrives at the stable while the sky is still gray. Franz speaks softly to Max as he approaches, his voice low and steady. Horses sense fear, Franz knows. They sense uncertainty. So he keeps his own fear buried deep, and offers Max only calmness. Franz checks Max's hooves first. This is essential. A horse with a cracked hoof or a loose shoe is useless, and in wartime, uselessness means death. He runs his hand along Max's legs, feeling for heat or swelling. He checks the horse's eyes, his gums, listening to his breathing. Max is tired. He pulled a supply wagon for 12 hours yesterday, but he seems sound. Breakfast is a small ration of oats and hay. Not as much as Max needs, really. Supplies are tight. The fields where the army used to source hay are now battlefields, churned to mud and craters. So Max gets less than he should, and Franz feels a pang of guilt as he pours the grain into the feed bag. By the time the sun rises, Max is harnessed to a wagon. The wagon is heavy, loaded with ammunition crates. Another horse, a gray mare named Greta, is harnessed beside him. Together they will pull this load 15 miles to the front lines. The road is terrible. It was once a paved road, but shells have torn it apart. Now it is a mix of mud, broken stone, and deep ruts. Max leans into the harness, his muscles straining. His breath comes hard and rhythmic. Beside him, Greta does the same. Franz walks beside them, occasionally murmuring encouragement. Other wagons move along the same road, a long line of horses and carts stretching into the distance. The sound is a constant rumble: hooves, wheels, the creak of wood and leather. Sometimes, the sound of artillery joins in. Distant at first, then closer. Max's ears flick nervously. He has learned to fear that sound. But Franz is there, a steady hand on the bridle, and Max keeps moving. At midday, they stop to rest. Max is given water from a canvas bucket. He drinks deeply, gratefully. Franz allows him to graze on the sparse grass at the roadside for a few minutes. It is not much, but it is something. By evening, they reach their destination. The wagon is unloaded. Max and Greta are unharnessed, led to a makeshift corral. There is no stable here, no shelter. Just a patch of ground surrounded by rope. The horses stand together, exhausted, their heads low. Franz checks Max one more time before he leaves. He runs a hand along the horse's neck, feels the heat radiating from his body. "Good boy," he whispers. "Good boy." And then Franz is gone, and Max is left standing in the dark, surrounded by the sounds of war, and waiting for tomorrow, when it will all begin again. The wind moves softly through the grass, and somewhere, a horse sighs deeply and rests. Now let us turn our attention to another figure. Not a horse handler, but a mechanic. His name is James. He is 22 years old, from Ohio. Before the war, he worked in a garage, fixing Model T Fords for farmers and shopkeepers. He understood engines. He could listen to the sound of a motor and know what was wrong. He could take apart a carburetor and put it back together in the dark. When James enlisted, he expected to be handed a rifle. Instead, he was handed a wrench. The American Expeditionary Forces needed mechanics desperately. For every truck they brought to France, they needed men who could keep those trucks running. And so James found himself assigned to a motor transport unit, part of a vast network of repair depots, supply convoys, and mobile workshops. His job was simple: keep the trucks moving. But simplicity, he quickly learned, did not mean ease. The trucks were tough, but they were not indestructible. The roads were brutal. Axles snapped. Tires blew out. Engines overheated. And when a truck broke down in the middle of a convoy, it had to be fixed immediately. There was no time to tow it back to a depot. The war did not wait. So James and his fellow mechanics became experts in field repairs. They carried toolkits strapped to their backs. They learned to improvise, using wire when they ran out of bolts, fashioning makeshift gaskets from leather or rubber scraps. They worked by flashlight, in the rain, in the cold, their hands black with grease and oil. But there was something satisfying about it. Something almost meditative. James liked the logic of engines. If something was broken, there was a reason. Find the reason, fix the problem. Engines did not panic. They did not tire. They simply worked, or they did not. One night, James was called to fix a truck that had stalled on the road to the front. The driver was frantic. He was carrying medical supplies, urgently needed at a field hospital. James climbed under the truck with his flashlight, ignoring the sound of distant shelling. The problem was the fuel line. A small crack, leaking gasoline. James patched it with a strip of rubber and some wire, tightened the connections, then crawled back out. "Try it now," he said. The driver turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. The driver grinned. "You're a miracle worker." James shrugged. "Just doing my job." But as he watched the truck drive away, its taillights fading into the darkness, he felt a quiet pride. He was not a soldier, not in the traditional sense. He would never charge across a battlefield. But he was part of something. A vast, mechanical network that was keeping the American army moving. And as the weeks and months went on, that network grew stronger. More trucks arrived. More mechanics were trained. Repair depots became more efficient. Supply lines became faster, more reliable. The Americans were learning, adapting, building something new. And across the lines, the Germans were beginning to feel the pressure. Their horses were exhausted. Their supply lines were stretched thin. And every time they tried to move, to respond, to adapt, the Americans were already there, faster, stronger, supplied by a fleet of trucks that never seemed to stop. The age of the machine had arrived. And it was relentless. In the distance, an engine hummed steadily, a sound that does not tire, does not falter, a sound that speaks of the future. By the winter of 1918, the situation for Germany was becoming dire. Not because of a single great battle lost. Not because of a dramatic breakthrough by the Allies. But because of something quieter. Something that crept up slowly, like a cold fog settling over the landscape. Exhaustion. The German army was running out of everything. Food. Ammunition. Fuel. And most critically, horses. The numbers tell the story. Of the 2.8 million horses Germany mobilized at the start of the war, more than half were dead. Killed in battle, yes, but more often killed by disease, by starvation, by sheer overwork. The German Veterinary Corps did what it could, but there were limits. Limits to how much they could do with dwindling supplies. Limits to how many horses could be replaced. And horses, unlike trucks, cannot be manufactured in a factory. A horse takes years to breed and train. A truck can be assembled in weeks. The German supply lines, once efficient and well organized, were beginning to collapse. Wagons sat idle for lack of horses to pull them. Artillery pieces could not be moved. Wounded soldiers waited hours, sometimes days, for transport to field hospitals. And all the while, the Americans kept coming. Their trucks rolled through the mud, day and night. Their supply convoys stretched for miles, a constant flow of food, ammunition, medical supplies. The American soldiers on the front lines were better fed, better equipped, better supplied than their German counterparts. This was not the war Germany had prepared for. Germany had prepared for a war of discipline, of tradition, of time-tested methods. They had prepared for a war where logistics moved at the pace of hooves. But the war had changed. And Germany, for all its strength, for all its courage, could not keep up. There is a quiet tragedy in this. The German soldiers were not cowards. The German officers were not incompetent. The German horses were not weak. But they were facing an enemy that had industrialized war in a way that had never been done before. The Americans had turned logistics into a science. They had applied the same principles that built their factories, their railroads, their sprawling cities, and applied them to war. And it worked. In the German camps, the soldiers could see it. They could hear the American trucks in the distance, a constant rumble that never seemed to stop. They could see the supply dumps the Americans built, vast mountains of crates and barrels. They could see how quickly the Americans moved, how they seemed to have everything they needed, always. And they looked at their own dwindling supplies, their exhausted horses, their empty ration tins, and they knew. The war was lost. Not in a single moment. Not in a dramatic climax. But slowly, inevitably, like a clock winding down. By the autumn of 1918, the German High Command knew it too. They began to seek an armistice. Not because they had been defeated in a final, decisive battle, but because they could no longer sustain the fight. They had run out of resources. They had run out of time. And perhaps most symbolically, they had run out of horses. The age they had known, the age of tradition and muscle and ancient partnerships, was ending. And in its place, the age of the machine had begun. The night is very quiet now, and somewhere, far away, the last horses of the war stand silently in their corrals, waiting for a dawn that would bring a different world. When the war ended on November 11, 1918, the world celebrated. Church bells rang. Soldiers embraced. Crowds filled the streets of London, Paris, New York. But in the muddy fields of France and Belgium, millions of horses stood in makeshift corrals, their fate uncertain. What do you do with millions of horses when the war is over? The answer, for many nations, was heartbreaking. Horses are expensive to transport. Shipping a horse across the ocean costs as much as shipping several tons of cargo. And after 4 years of brutal war, most of the horses that survived were in poor condition. They were old, injured, exhausted. Many would never fully recover. So the decision was made, quietly, without much fanfare, that most of the horses would not be going home. The British government sold many of its horses to French farmers, butchers, and knackers. Some were put to work in the fields, helping to rebuild the devastated countryside. Others were slaughtered for meat. The French did the same. Tens of thousands of horses were sold or simply abandoned. The Germans, already struggling with food shortages and economic collapse, could not afford to bring their horses home either. Many were left behind, turned loose, or sold for whatever they could fetch. Only the Americans made a different choice. The United States decided to bring most of its horses home. Not out of sentimentality, exactly, but because American horses were valuable. They were still relatively young, still strong, still useful. And the cost of shipping them, while high, was something the wealthy American government could afford. Still, many horses were left behind. And for those that were left, the end was often grim. But there were small mercies too. Small acts of kindness. Some soldiers, before they left, sought out the horses they had worked with. They brought them apples, carrots, lumps of sugar. They spoke to them softly, thanked them, said goodbye. Franz, the young German soldier we met earlier, found Max one last time before he was sent home. Max was thinner now, his coat rough, his eyes tired. But he was alive. Franz had no sugar to give him. No apples. But he stood with Max for a long while, his hand on the horse's neck, and he whispered, "Thank you? I'm sorry." And then he walked away. Max was sold to a French farmer a few weeks later. The farmer was kind, and Max spent his last years pulling a plow in a quiet field in Normandy. It was hard work, but it was peaceful. No artillery. No mud. No fear. When Max died several years later, the farmer buried him at the edge of the field, beneath an old oak tree. No monument. No plaque. Just a mound of earth, slowly covered by grass. There are millions of stories like Max's. Millions of horses who served, who suffered, who were forgotten. History remembers the generals, the battles, the treaties. But the horses are ghosts now. Silent, invisible, lost to time. Except in quiet moments like this. When we pause, and remember. And honor the millions of creatures who carried humanity through one of its darkest hours. The wind moves softly through the field, and beneath the old oak tree, the earth is still, and peaceful, and quiet. While the horses faded into memory, the trucks kept rolling. The First World War was, in many ways, the last great war of the horse, and the first true war of the machine. The lessons learned by the Americans in France were not forgotten. When the war ended, the U.S. military conducted extensive studies on the effectiveness of motorized transport. The conclusions were overwhelming. Trucks were faster, more reliable, more efficient than horses. The future of military logistics was mechanical. And so the American military began to invest heavily in motor transport. They built motor pools. They trained drivers and mechanics. They developed new vehicles, bigger trucks, better engines, vehicles designed specifically for military use. Other nations watched and learned. The British, the French, the Italians, they all began to motorize their armies. The horse, which had served in war for thousands of years, was slowly but steadily being replaced. By the time the Second World War began in 1939, the transformation was nearly complete. The American army that landed in Normandy in 1944 was almost entirely motorized. Jeeps, trucks, half-tracks, tanks, an entire army on wheels and treads, moving with a speed and flexibility that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. The Germans, ironically, still relied heavily on horses in World War II. Despite their reputation for technological prowess, the German army used millions of horses throughout the war. They could not produce enough trucks, enough fuel, to fully motorize their forces. And once again, the difference in logistics played a crucial role in the outcome of the war. But the influence of the motor age extended far beyond the battlefield. The infrastructure built to support military trucks, roads, repair depots, fuel supply networks, became the foundation for civilian transportation in the post-war years. The mechanics trained during the war returned home and opened garages, became engineers, taught the next generation. The trucks themselves, many of them surplus military vehicles, were sold to farmers, businesses, and families. They became workhorses in a different sense, hauling goods, building communities, connecting towns. The interstate highway system in the United States, begun in the 1950s, was explicitly designed with military logistics in mind. President Eisenhower, who had seen firsthand the importance of good roads during the war, championed the project. The highways were not just for commerce, they were for tanks, for troop transport, for moving an army quickly across the country if needed. The world was remaking itself in the image of the machine. And it happened so quickly. In the span of a single generation, the entire structure of transportation changed. The horse, which had been central to human civilization for 5,000 years, became optional, nostalgic, quaint, a symbol of a simpler time. But there is something worth noting here, as we reflect on this shift. The machine was more efficient, yes. More powerful, yes. But it was not more humane. The relationship between a person and a horse was a partnership. It required patience, understanding, empathy. You could not simply turn a key and expect a horse to obey. You had to earn its trust. A machine requires no such thing. It obeys or it breaks. And perhaps, in our rush toward efficiency, toward speed and power and control, we lost something. Not everything. Not even most things. But something. A certain kind of connection. A certain kind of respect for the living world. And that loss is worth remembering. The road stretches on into the night, and the hum of engines fades slowly into silence. There are letters, diaries, scraps of memory preserved in archives. Soldiers wrote about the horses. Not often, but sometimes. In quiet moments between battles, they would write home and mention the horses they worked with. One British soldier, in a letter to his sister, wrote, "The horses suffer more than we do, I think. They do not understand why we ask so much of them. But they try. God, how they try." An American officer, in his diary, described watching a convoy of trucks pass a column of horse-drawn wagons on a muddy road in France. He wrote, "The wagons struggled, the horses straining, their hooves slipping in the mud. The trucks simply drove past, steady and sure. I felt a strange sadness watching, as if we were leaving something behind. Something we cannot get back." A German veterinarian kept detailed notes on the horses he treated. His records are clinical, precise. He was a scientist, after all. But occasionally, a note of emotion slips through. Next to the entry for a horse named Blitz, who died of exhaustion, he wrote simply, "I am sorry." These voices are faint now. The men who wrote them are long gone. But their words remain, preserved in dusty archives, waiting for someone to listen. And what they tell us is this: the transition was not easy. It was not celebrated. It was, for many, a source of quiet grief. The horse was not just a tool. It was a companion. A presence. A link to a world that was slower, perhaps, but also more connected to the rhythms of life. When the machine replaced the horse, something was gained. Speed. Efficiency. Power. But something was also lost. And the people who lived through that transition felt it. They felt the absence. There is a photograph, taken in 1919, of a soldier standing beside a truck. He is smiling, proud. Behind him, in the background, you can just make out a stable. The doors are open. The stalls are empty. The caption beneath the photo reads, "The future has arrived." But if you look closely at the soldier's face, you can see something else. Something harder to name. Perhaps it is nostalgia. Perhaps it is uncertainty. Perhaps it is simply the knowledge that the world has changed, and there is no going back. We, living now in the 21st century, are so far removed from that world. We have never harnessed a horse. We have never walked beside a wagon, murmuring encouragement to a tired animal. We have never felt the warmth of a horse's breath on a cold morning. But we can still understand, I think. Because we, too, live in a time of rapid change. Of old things being replaced by new things. Of connections being lost, even as efficiencies are gained. And perhaps, in these quiet moments, when we remember the past, not with judgment, but with tenderness, we can honor both the progress we have made and the things we have left behind. Both can be true. The machine made the world faster, stronger, more capable. But the horse carried us with patience, with partnership, with a kind of grace that no machine will ever match. And that is worth remembering. The stars are out now, distant and quiet, and the world feels very still. So what does all of this mean for us, now, more than a century later? Why should we care about horses and trucks, about a war fought long before we were born, about a transition that happened in a world so different from ours? Perhaps because the pattern repeats. We are living, right now, through another great transition. Not from horses to engines, but from human labor to artificial intelligence. From analog to digital. From the physical to the virtual. And just as in 1917, the change is happening quickly. Faster than we can fully process. Jobs that existed for generations are disappearing. Skills that were once essential are becoming obsolete. The world is being remade, once again, in the image of efficiency. And once again, there is both excitement and loss. The excitement is real. The possibilities are extraordinary. Machines that can think, learn, create. Technologies that can solve problems we once thought unsolvable. A future where human beings are freed from drudgery, able to focus on creativity, connection, meaning. But the loss is real too. The loss of certain kinds of work. Certain kinds of connection. Certain kinds of identity. And just as the soldiers of 1918 felt a strange sadness watching the trucks roll past the horses, so too do many people today feel a quiet grief as they watch the world change around them. This does not mean we should resist change. Progress is not the enemy. But it does mean we should be thoughtful. We should be intentional. We should ask ourselves, what do we want to carry forward from the old world, even as we embrace the new? The Americans in 1917 did not reject the horse out of cruelty. They simply chose a better tool for the job at hand. But they also, in their letters and diaries, honored what the horse had been. What it had meant. And perhaps that is the lesson. We can embrace the future, while still honoring the past. We can move forward, while still remembering what we leave behind. The world of the horse is gone now. It exists only in photographs, in old letters, in stories like this one. But the lessons remain. The lesson of partnership, of patience, of the value of living things. The lesson that efficiency is not the only measure of worth. The lesson that sometimes the slower way, the gentler way, has its own kind of value. These lessons do not belong only to the past. They belong to us. And they will belong to those who come after us. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, as the world around you fades into quiet, remember the horses. Remember Max, and Greta, and the millions of others who served without choice, without recognition, without reward. Remember the young soldiers like Franz, who did their best in impossible circumstances. Remember the mechanics like James, who built the future with grease-stained hands. Remember the moment when two worlds met, the world of the horse, and the world of the machine, and how that meeting changed everything. And remember that we, too, are living through such a moment. And the choices we make, the things we choose to carry forward, and the things we choose to honor, will shape the world that comes after us. Just as those choices, made a century ago, shaped ours. The night is deep now, and the stars turn slowly overhead, and history whispers softly in the dark. Before we close, let me tell you about one more horse. Her name was Warrior. Warrior was a British cavalry horse, owned by an officer named Jack Seeley. She served on the Western Front for the entire duration of the war, for long years. She survived gas attacks, artillery barrages, and the chaos of battle. Against all odds, she lived. When the war ended, Seeley brought Warrior home to England. And Warrior lived for many more years, grazing peacefully in the English countryside. She became something of a legend. People would come to see her, to touch her, to remember. When Warrior died in 1941, she was buried with full military honors. She was called the horse the Germans could not kill. But Warrior's story is rare. Most horses were not so lucky. Most were left behind, forgotten, lost to history. And yet, they are not entirely gone. If you visit the battlefields of France and Belgium today, you will find memorials. Monuments to the soldiers who fought and died. But you will also find, if you look carefully, a few quiet memorials to the horses. There is one in Ascot, England. A simple stone, inscribed with the words, "To all the animals that served and died in the Great War. They had no choice." There is another in Hyde Park, London. A large bronze monument depicting horses, dogs, mules, all the animals that served. The inscription reads, "They had no voice." These memorials are small. They are easily overlooked. But they are there. Because some people remembered. Some people cared. And they wanted the rest of us to remember too. So tonight, as you close your eyes and let yourself drift toward sleep, spare a thought for the horses. For the 3 million horses of Germany, and the hundreds of thousands of horses of France, Britain, America, and all the other nations. For the horses who pulled the wagons and the cannons. Who carried the wounded and the weary. Who stood patiently in the rain and the mud and the cold. For the horses who had no choice, but gave everything anyway. And remember too the men and women who cared for them. Who fed them, groomed them, whispered to them in the dark. Who tried, in the midst of war, to hold on to a little bit of humanity. The age of the horse has passed. The age of the machine is here. But the memory remains. And as long as we remember, they are not truly gone. So rest now. Let the weight of the day slip away. Let your thoughts grow soft and hazy. And know that history is not just a list of dates and battles and treaties. It is also made of small things. Quiet things. The sound of hooves on cobblestone. The hum of an engine in the distance. A soldier's hand on a horse's neck. A whispered, "Thank you?" These things matter. They always have. And they always will. Sleep well. Dream softly. And may you wake to a world that remembers and honors both the past and the future. Good night.